Uh, yeah. I don't have a fun quip about this one. It's dark and it's depressing. On this episode of Moving Panels, we discuss When the Wind Blows. Welcome to Moving Panels, the podcast where we discuss movies and TV shows based on, inspired by, and adapted from the world of comic books. I'm your host, Laramy Wells, and joining me today in the co-host chair is my wonderful wife, Bethany. How are you, Bethany?
I'm all right. How are you?
Yeah. So this is probably one of the most depressing reviews we have done. It is the 1986 movie When the Wind Blows, written by Raymond Briggs. It is based on a graphic novel, and it is meant to be kind of a dark comedy satire, but the comedy ends about halfway through it.
That's generous.
And so...
because the impending dread really overtakes any kind of comedic undertones.
Yeah, so we will try to keep this as light as possible. For those of you that don't know what we're talking about, I didn't either until we did the best 80s comic book movie a couple months ago. And when I was doing the research, I stumbled upon this one. Then found out that it was very highly praised. In fact, based off of the way I was ranking things for the bracket, it would have been ranked number one. But I found out it was on Tubi. I decided to give it a watch, and I was hooked after that. I bought the graphic novel. I did finally get a hold of the Blu-ray, and I just told Bethany, I was like, we got to go ahead and do this.
He said, Bethany, this is haunting. It's the most haunting thing I've ever seen. You've got to see it.
But it's good.
It is.
So
it is good, but...
So again, this movie was released October 24th, 1986 in the United Kingdom. It is a British film. It was released in the United States March 11th, 1988. So a couple years later. And it was directed by Jimmy Murakami. And I apologize.
He's a Japanese...
He's Japanese American. In fact, his name is not actually Jimmy. It is Teruaki, which that name was taken from him at the age of 9 when he and his family were placed in a concentration camp in Northern California.
I really didn't think this movie could get bleaker, Laramy.
Yeah. So yes, Japanese American. He was born in 1942. And so anybody who knows their history knows what happened in the 40s. And so he wasn't born in 1942, excuse me. He was born in the 30s. And then in 1942, after Pearl Harbor, he and his family, who, again, he was born in America, so he is an American citizen, but his father was not. But it didn't matter, because at that time, pretty much anyone who was of Japanese ancestry was round up here in America, and they were taken to what they called war relocation centers.
Concentration camps.
Which were concentration camps. He and his family were placed in Tule Lake in Northern California, and he was there for 4 years. There's a documentary that tells his story. The documentary is called Non-Alien. And the reason it's called Non-Alien, as they explain in the movie, is the notice that went out, was hanging up in all the cities, informing people of Japanese ancestry. It said alien and non-alien. And when the guy at the museum is explaining that, he goes, why did they use the phrase non-alien? He said, well, what is a non-alien? A citizen. But they couldn't say citizen because citizens have rights. And so they used the phrase non-alien. And so that's what he titled his documentary. But the documentary is a special feature on the Blu-ray. But I also found out it's on Tubi, just like the movie is. So if you are interested, you can see both the movie When the Wind Blows and the documentary about the director called Non-Alien is also available. And in the documentary, he returns to Tule Lake. and I think the documentary was done in 2010. I want to say it was. I didn't write it down. So it's a powerful story. Don't want to get into it too much because we're here to talk about When the Wind Blows. But and again, Jimmy Murakami had a great career. He won an Academy Award for one of his works. He was an artist himself, although I don't think he drew this movie because I think it was just using the drawings from Raymond Briggs. But he did other things. He was even, to kind of liven it up a little bit, he was one of the producers of the 1989 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles animated series.
Wow, that's really nice.
Yeah. But
I'm crying. I'm silently crying, but that's great.
So When the Wind Blows is an animated film. It does, based off a graphic novel, it does merge. It's kind of got a hybrid animation to it.
Yeah.
It merges the hand-drawn style of the graphic novel with stop motion.
Which I really liked because the props, the items they interact with are real live items.
Yeah.
And
it was like a miniature set.
Yeah, the animation, it's very what's the word I want to look? It's kind of I don't want to say childish, but it's very reminiscent of like a child's storybook. It's it's like a wholesome type. The characters themselves are very like cartoon, not cartoonish is not really the term I'm looking for. Like I said, just like a wholesome, you would see it in a child's storybook.
Yeah, because the two of them presumably are in their 60s, maybe 70s. The two main characters, the only characters. But they are drawn to almost look childish.
Yes. And then my thing about the stop motion and that, so it lures you in with this like comfort of like, oh, this is just going to be a sweet story. And then there's the realistic items that they interact with, which brings a realism to it that I don't think it would have if it had been completely animated in the same style.
Yeah. Yeah, so their home, tables, chairs, all of that. It's again, it's like a miniature set. Probably the same type of thing they would use for a stop motion movie. Like a lot of the stuff that maybe they use for like Nightmare Before Christmas.
Right.
Or Chicken Run, those type of stop motion stuff, but then they just have actually hand-drawn characters, cartoons, interacting with all of it. So let's get into the characters. So this movie, again, features only two characters. And these two characters, honestly, could be anyone's parents, grandparents, aunt and uncle.
Loved ones. Like, they're people that you recognize. Mm-hmm. They're real people. They talk to each other. And it's sweet. And you instantly like them. You feel kind of protective over them because you get kind of the impression that they're not the smartest people.
Yeah.
They're kind of gullible. But they're good people. They worked hard their whole lives. And they've worked hard for what they have. And you have this sense of just like I said, you want to protect them. You want to nurture them. And anyways, continue.
Yeah. So from what I gathered, the characters are Jim and Hilda Bloggs. I didn't gather that. But the characters
gathered that by watching the movie.
The characters are Jim and Hilda Bloggs. They are, from my research, I found out they are loose interpretations of Raymond Briggs' actual parents.
Yeah, he kind of described his parents as just, he said simple, although he said his parents were not quite as simple as Jim and Hilda. But they are the type that would just very easily accept whatever it is the government told them.
Yeah. And we'll get into more of what the story is like, here and there throughout. We'll get more into it probably in the moving panel section. But I don't want to lay a lot of that on real thick yet. I will say this. Now, Bethany and I both did this. Each of us did it opposite. I saw the movie first, then read the comic. Bethany read the comic, then saw the movie. I have to say that the voice actors add a whole different
Oh,
level, a whole
absolutely.
different dimension to the story that you wouldn't get just from reading, because I don't think you would in your own head read these characters the way they are performed by these voice actors.
I will say too, and maybe I'm showing my hand here a little too early, but I prefer the way the movie is laid out because so much of it is supposed to be visual. In the graphic novel, there's a lot of dialogue. Like, there's a lot of dialogue in the movie, but the dialogue's written out.
Yeah.
And it takes up a lot of space on the panel, so there's not as much to see. And a lot of their dialogue's repetitive and contradictive, and it kind of goes in circles, and that kind of, after a while, it kind of gets old.
And the graphic novel, so it's kind of the size of a children's picture book. It's not your traditional size. It's not novel size. It's like a magazine
It's like a 10 by
size.
12 sized book.
And it's really thin. But when you go through it, there's like 12 panels per page. So, like Bethany's saying, they're tiny panels. And then there's just a lot of dialogue. But let's get into the characters. So I'm going to start with Hilda. Hilda Bloggs, who was voiced by Dame Peggy Ashcroft, who is the 1985 Oscar winner for Best Supporting Actress.
Wow.
For the film A Passage to India.
Never seen that, but that's really cool.
And she was a huge stage actress in Britain. She actually has a memorial plaque in Poets' Corner of Westminster Abbey.
Oh, wow.
There is a theater in Croydon that is named after her. And the Royal Shakespeare Company has an Ashcroft room that's used for rehearsals that's named after her.
So just a real no-name, like, just found her type voice.
And Hilda, she is the type of wife who she wants to make sure everything is just right, just so. And then she trusts her husband.
Well, yeah.
And even when he's doing things that she doesn't like, once he explains it in his own way, she says, well, okay, but, make sure you don't do this or make sure you don't do that. And she just kind of shrugs things off when she doesn't really agree with it.
Right. She's very much of her time. She's clearly a woman that was raised to be like, okay, well, you can have an opinion, but at the end of the day, it's your husband's opinion that proceeds, whether it makes sense or not.
Yeah.
And they've clearly been married. Like, they animate kind of their relationship, in a very heartbreaking way. But they've clearly been together almost their entire lives, and they know each other. And her home, you get the impression she was a homemaker. She didn't work outside of the home. And so, yeah, her her curtains, that is what represents her. That is what she has to show to the world of her success. Her house looks nice. Her husband is fed. That is her, displaying to the world that she is successful at her, life, if that makes sense.
Yeah. To just go ahead and get into this. This is not the first story with these two characters. I found out that you could call it a sequel, I guess, if you want. But Hilda and Jim appeared in an earlier story that Raymond Briggs wrote called Gentleman Jim. That was about Jim, but Hilda is featured in it as well. And so I guess he just liked these two characters and decided to bring them back for this story and just kind of just crush our hearts with this one. But let's get into Jim. So Jim Bloggs is voiced by Sir John Mills. So both actors are
knighted.
Yeah. Some might recognize the name John Mills. John Mills played Father Robinson in the 1960 Swiss Family Robinson movie. He was Gus the theater cat in the 1998 filmed version of Cats.
Huh.
And what I think is going to surprise Bethany, he's Haley Mills's father.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. So really, just another up and coming, no name, discover him off the street. Okay, good.
Yeah. I know some of our probably younger listeners are going to go, "Who's Haley Mills?" I don't know who Haley Mills is.
The Parent Trap,
The original,
but not Lindsay Lohan.
Original Parent, Pollyanna. She was who the show Saved by the Bell was actually
supposed to be about.
She was Miss Bliss. Anyway, so John, very simple-minded. In this story, it is obvious that he lives with blind confidence in things that he himself doesn't really understand.
Right. He believes that the government and all of, society as a whole is looking out for his best interests. No one would lie to him. He's very gullible. Like, even something simple at the beginning, he goes to get a protractor. He's not able to get one because they're all sold out. And most likely, it's not that they're sold out. It's that they just don't have protractors. And they just give him like a piece of cardboard. And he's like, this is fine.
Yeah, the store owner measures out the angle he needs.
Blind faith that this piece of cardboard is going to save his life.
Well, and even when he's following the directions and the pamphlet, when he questions something in it, he goes, well, I'm sure they've thought about this. They've thought about this. There's a reason behind this. And then, so yeah, I'm going to have to lead into this a little bit. What breaks my heart in this is I say a little bit more so than Hilda. He maintains such a positive attitude, even when his body starts breaking down.
Literally, he and his wife are dying.
Yeah.
Like, dying. Like, it's not even a question. They are almost, they have almost reached the point of acceptance that they are going to die. And he still has hope that the government is going to show up and bring the newspaper and help them. So,
again, we've kind of spoiled a little bit, but again, you know that when you listen.
30-plus-year-old movie.
But you also know that when you listen to this that we're going to spoil. So if you had any interest in this, hopefully, and I would say even after we spoiled it, it is still worth the watch. But let's go ahead.
Stories, I will say, if you're worried about us spoiling it, just the context, like just the premise of the story, you know how it's going to end.
Yeah.
Like there's really only one way for it to end.
Yeah, and the cover of the graphic novel, the cover of the movie, even when you pull it up on Tubi, the picture that pops up, it is the two of them standing in front of a mushroom cloud. And so this story takes place in the 80s, probably early 80s. And, of course, we were in the Cold War.
Right.
With Russia, and it was, you had Russia, you had China, you had us, it's like who is going to push the button first? And they are alerted that there is going to be a possible attack, and so he starts to prepare for it. And so we're going to pause right there, and then we're going to come back and start into our moving panels and talk about this story.
What seems to be the problem, pal?
There's just so much pain in the world, so many issues. I don't think I can bear it.
Well, friendo, it sounds like you could use a dose of pop culture roulette.
Pop culture roulette? What's that? Some sort of pop culture themed podcast or something?
That's right, sonny boy. When hope seems far, dive into some PCR.
But I already get my entertainment news from Variety.
Huh, that's pretty good. If you're a chucklehead, PCR gives you news you need, condensed, unfiltered, and raw, from three nerds who know a little something about something.
Wow, okay, sign me up.
That's the spirit. Pop Culture Roulette. New episodes every Monday, available on all major podcast directories.
Life moves pretty fast. If you don't stop and listen to an 80s Flick Flashback podcast once in a while, you could miss it. Do you love movies of a certain age? Do you miss the days of VHS tapes, VCRs, and the video rental stores? Does the thought of another 80s movie being remade seem inconceivable? My name is Tim Williams. I'm the creator and host of the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast. On each episode, I'm joined by guest co-hosts to discuss one of the many movies released in the 1980s. We share our first-time watch memories, our favorite scenes, and even learn some behind-the-scenes stories about the cast and crew along the way. New episodes are released every other Friday on your favorite podcasting platform. So make like a tree, get out of here, and go listen to an excellent episode of the 80s Flick Flashback Podcast. The ad is over. Go home. Go.
All right, so let's get into the moving panels. Right before we went to the break, I was talking about how they are preparing for an attack. And what Jim does is, he panics at first, thinking, oh, it's happening a lot sooner than I thought. And he runs out to the store to get stuff. And one of the other things he does is he swings by the library.
Now, he's already swung by the library. He swings by the library before they even
that's
know
right.
that's going to happen.
Because then he realizes, I'm glad I picked up these pamphlets.
Yeah, because it's in the news. Everyone knows that nuclear war is inevitable.
Yeah. And so he looks through his pamphlets and he decides that the best one is a pamphlet called Protect and Survive, which was a real pamphlet. It was a pamphlet. It was PSAs, I guess you would call them, that aired on television that were produced by the British
during classes.
Yeah. They were produced by the British government from 1974 to 1980. Some of those public service films are actually special features on the Blu-ray. And Bethany and I watched them.
And it was dark.
Yeah. There's a lot of, when there's an attack, here's what you should do. And you can see in the videos, a lot of what they do in this movie, in this graphic novel, is exactly what they were being
told to do. And I would like to point out, one of the things that struck me specifically was it seemed like if you lived in a home that was a single story, or if you lived in an apartment complex or something along those lines, you were in more trouble than someone who had a multi-story home.
Yeah.
A person with a multi-story home is probably a person who's a bit more affluent than a person who lives in an apartment building or a single-story home. And one of the things they said was, if you live in a single-story home, you need to try to make other arrangements. Not like, we're going to provide shelters for people, but
if you have a neighbor with a multi...
you, poor person, need to figure out something else.
Yeah, and so one of the things they talk about, which is what Jim and Hilda do, is making a lean-to using doors. So you would take doors off of, your house, and you would create this, essentially you create a fort up against the wall. And this is what he needed the protractor for, because it had to be, they even said it had to be a certain angle. And you put the doors on it, the pillows and
blankets,
everything.
This food, all the supplies you need, everything. Yeah. And your and
a box of sand for washing your dishes.
Yeah.
That was in there. And this was supposed to protect you from radiation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again, I'm watching this and I'm just
horrified.
And you start to already feel for Jim and Hilda, because it's hard here in 2023 to think of who would actually think this is going to help. That this is going to, and I guess they didn't know that much about radiation then.
They knew enough by that point.
You would think.
At the very least, the government knew enough to know that what they were telling people was not going to help them.
Because they even had where he paints the windows white, because it's supposed to reduce the fire damage by reflecting the heat from a nuclear blast. And I'm sorry, I've seen enough videos of a nuclear blast, knocking down the, wooden shack to know that white paint is not going to stop anything.
No.
And it doesn't. So go ahead and say this. There is a nuclear blast. And when it happens, we see a lot of things happen. We see a train get derailed. We see a bunch of other things happen, and then we follow it into
Their home.
their home, and we just see, and again, this is a real set, and we see these windows get blown out and things just flying everywhere. And because it's real, it's not animated, it acts like an actual explosion would.
Right.
And there they are laying in, in this modified lean-to with this big opening on the end of it.
Right.
And they do survive it.
For now.
They do survive it. They then proceed to continue to follow what they need to do. They stay in there for the 48 hours after they get out, and they try to, use the radio, but the radio's not working. They try to use TV, but TV's not working.
Water doesn't work.
Yeah, they have no power. And of course, Jim is just, it makes sense. They have to conserve the power.
Yeah.
And, they have to conserve water. And then when the newspaper doesn't arrive, he was
like, oh, well, the roads are probably backed up, but we'll get it later today. Or
yeah. And the same thing with the milk. They think the milkman's going to run. And then they question, oh, he didn't come today. And they're like, well, he's, they're probably they need the resources for the soldiers that are going to go out and fight. And yeah. And then you start having those scenes where Hilda and Jim, but Hilda, I think, does it first, starts talking about not feeling good.
Hilda breaks my heart throughout the entire story. And I'm just going to kind of show my hand here. The reason why I'm not as chatty in this episode is I feel a lot of feelings, and it makes me really emotional. And so I'm trying to think of ways to discuss this in a way that makes sense without getting too upset.
Yeah.
But you just watch her, and she's trying so hard. It breaks my heart because initially, like, she's just trying to clean up. She gets out of the little lean-to,
sweeping,
and her sweet little house that she has spent her entire adult life making her own. Like, that is all she has had to show for her life. She's never made money of her own, but she has provided for her family by keeping a nice house, keeping her family fed, and all of that. And she can't do that anymore. And she's trying to sweep, and she's trying to clean things, and she's just so sad at, like, the minor things. And it's one of those things where she doesn't quite realize the severity of what's happened yet, and how just sad she is for all that she has lost. It's heartbreaking. Like, on the outside, just not thinking about it too much, you're just like, oh my gosh, this woman's worried about her curtains, when really, the world has just blown up. That is all she has to show for her life. That is her life's work.
Yeah. And but then, like I said, she starts talking about having a headache.
Bleed. Yeah.
I think it starts with the headache.
Yeah, it starts with a headache.
Starts talking about the headache, and then
she's not hungry.
Yeah, and that Jim says the same thing, how he's not hungry. Then there's one day they wake up, and Jim's like, well, let's go outside and walk in the garden. And they go out there, and they do mention fallout. And they talk about, well, I don't see anything. And of course that hits me, because I'm like, you're not going to see it. That's they
don't know that.
But they don't know that. And they talk about how the walkway, the road is warped. And so that explains why they haven't gotten the newspaper and the milk, because the roads are probably messed up.
And they want to, like, eat vegetables out of their garden, but they've basically disintegrated.
Yeah. And then they talk about how quiet it is.
Yeah. And
that's another thing that just hits you. And then Jim, again, in his positivity, he goes, I think we need to Hilda gets sick in the yard.
Yeah, she throws up. And
Jim says, you know what? I think we should just we should sit out here, get some sun, air.
That'll help us feel better. We also did not mention the fact that during the blast, they had a bunch of water set up for themselves.
Yes.
But the blast destroyed their
Almost
entire...
all of it.
Yeah, almost
There was
their
some of it,
entire
yeah.
water supply.
So they do have a little bit of water that they try to get through. They do have the little bit of food. We make it all the way to where they're at their last little piece of food, and they split it among each other. But going back to this scene, they're laying out outside, and then it starts to rain. And Jim thinks it's this great and wonderful thing.
They're going to collect the water.
They're going to collect the water, and that's going to be the water that they'll have to drink. And I'm just sitting there again going, I mean, acid rain.
And to their credit, they do think maybe
they
should
boil it.
Not that that's going to save it from radiation, but at least they did have that forward thinking.
Yeah. Again, we see them deteriorate, and the animation shows it.
Brutally.
Yeah. They get really dark circles around their eyes. Their faces kind of droop a little bit.
Hilda's hair goes from
and it starts to fall out.
It starts to fall out, and it goes from like a dark color to just like this dingy grayish color.
Then there's a moment where Hilda notices some sores on her legs, which Jim passes off as varicose veins.
And then he's like, look, I've got the same thing. It's fine. We're just old and we've been sleeping on the ground.
Well, and then he gets into the, look, I've got them too, and I'm a man. Which is another thing that kind of pops up in this a few times. Him trying to comfort her by saying, this is something that typically happens to women.
Yeah.
And then there's a few times where but it's happening to me too, and I'm a man, so, it's okay then. It's kind of the way he gives that across. But it does end with the two of them deciding that they're just too tired.
They're just going to go to sleep.
Which I'm pretty sure they had just woken up.
Yeah.
Like it was like the beginning of that day.
It was heartbreaking because was that the same day where she found the rat in the toilet?
Maybe.
And that that sweet baby.
Well, another thing we haven't talked about is when they talk about their son.
Oh, I don't want to think about that. It's so sad. They keep talking about their son and his family.
They speak to him on the phone at the beginning.
And the son is pretty... You get the impression the son is pretty realistic when it comes to what is coming. Yeah. Like, the son knows that it's hopeless.
And you get the impression based off of because you never hear the son. You just hear Jim's side of the conversation. You get the impression from Jim that the son and the family are getting away. And then after the blast, they have a moment where Jim tries to call his son, and he can't. The phone
lines are down.
It's not just that. They then zoom in on the phone, and it's melted.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And so you just have that moment, but then they just keep telling themselves, our boy's going to be fine.
He's a smart man. Yeah. He will have built it according to the pamphlets.
But again, just kind of, we're trying not to lay out the entire movie. But at the end, they decide that they're just too tired and maybe they just need a little bit more sleep. Just go ahead and call it for the day. And they both crawl in. They even decide to get into potato sacks, which is another thing that he read in the pamphlets. And so
because it's supposed to protect you from heat, covering yourself in paper sacks.
And so they get inside the potato sacks. They both lay down underneath the lean-to. And then Hilda asks James to pray. And I'm just going to say the movie ends with him praying.
It's... Y'all. It's tough.
Yeah. So, this is going to be a short episode. Because, again, there's not a lot of trivia to talk about with this one. Raymond Briggs, very successful. He's got the Snowman, which is a huge thing in Britain with Christmas, around Christmas time and all. And it's another one of his graphic novels that actually has no words in it. It's entirely a picture book. But I will tell you, it's kind of got a sad ending as well. There's
the
something about
snowman.
Raymond Briggs just
He's
likes to, because Gentleman Jim kind of has a sad ending.
I have decided not to read that just because I don't think I can emotionally handle that right now.
That's fine. I would recommend it just to get a little bit more knowledge about these characters. But let's go ahead and get into it. Bag it, stack it, or trade it. Go ahead, Bethany.
So it's tough. So I've got like a spiel that I want to say. I'm going to start off by saying I think I want to stack. No. Refresh. I want to bag it. Although it's not something I'm going to go back to and watch again and again and again. I think it's a movie and graphic novel that has something important to say that unfortunately continues to be relevant.
Yeah.
And it's basically that the powers that be, more often than not, have more interest in themselves and the continuing to be the powers that be than the well-being of the people they're meant to serve. Which is basically the thesis of this story. Is these people who are just good, regular people. They're not special. They're not, hyper intelligent. They're not super, there's nothing hugely tragic about them. They're just regular, the most average person you could know. And they have faith that the people who are leading them are going to take care of them. And unfortunately, a lot of times that's just not what happens.
Yeah.
And I would love for there to come a day when this story is completely irrelevant. That day is not today. I would like for a lot of people to know more about this story, to watch it, to take to heart what I have definitely been carrying around with me. Definitely come at it when you're in a place where maybe you're... I wouldn't say when you're in a good mood, but maybe not when you're already depressed.
Yeah, and I'm going to say bag it as well. Does it have rewatchability? Sure. But are you going to want to rewatch it?
No.
Probably not. I say...
But I will carry this story with me forever.
Yeah, I will say you'll watch it the once, but
maybe twice.
You'll want to share this movie with other people. Again, I did buy it on Blu-ray. It probably won't get watched anytime soon again. But if I'm talking to Tim or I'm talking to somebody and says, "Hey, you remember that When the Wind Blows that we were talking about?" I said, "I've got it if you want to see it." Again, it's on Tubi. I've already mentioned it to several people about, hey, just pull it up on Tubi and watch it on Tubi. And it might even be helpful to watch it on Tubi because, Tubi's going to break for the commercials.
You could take a minute to just go, ooh, okay.
But yeah, again, it is intended to be a satire. There are the moments where Jim has his fantasies.
Yeah.
And he's so lively about them, and you actually see the fantasies come true. But it is a satire, and it's a satire on, like Bethany's saying, it's on how the government attempts to always know exactly what we need, and a good chunk of the audience that the government is aiming towards will accept it. No questions asked. They will accept it. I told Bethany, we're not going to get real political on this, but anybody listening, you can make the connections.
Yeah. There are a bunch of connections you can make. Unfortunately, we're at a time and point, and we have always been, where there's a lot of things where you can point out how we know that's exactly how it will go. I mean, even in the situation here, there are lots of people that grew up during the Cold War who remember doing nuclear drills in school.
Get up under the desk.
Under the desk because that's going to save you from a nuclear attack.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there are other drills they do at school that I'm not going to get into because then they get emotional.
And again, we're not going to get political here. There's a lot of things that people can can argue and talk about that maybe this is implying. We're not going to get into that. We're just here to talk about graphic novel that got turned into a movie. Because this even goes to that, again, the government is talking to people that they know will listen to them. They'll know they'll do what they'll say. And even if they do question it, like I talked about Jim, they'll say, well, it is what they suggest.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, the line Jim says. It is what they recommend. And that it just is. I think for anybody who knows the movie Doctor Strangelove, I think this sits on a level with Doctor Strangelove. Now, Doctor Strangelove, of course, is a lot heavier on the comedy, but it tells a very similar story. It is a story that I think needs to be told. And I think that's one of the reasons why this movie does have the critic praise that it does. The reason why it would have been ranked number one based on that criteria that I looked at for the 80s comic book movies. And I am just amazed that I have gone this long without ever hearing of it. So I wanted to get it out there for everyone who listens to this show. And I say, even if you think we've spoiled this, it's still worth the watch.
It's very powerful, because I will say Laramy spoiled it for me. He tried to say, like, I don't want to tell you too much, but like just telling you the premise of it, how it's going to end. And it's something I feel like, regardless, like it's an important thing for anyone to see. It tells a story, and I think it's also very powerful because you touched on it at the beginning. It's directed by someone whose, culture was affected by the very thing that is mentioned in this story.
Yeah. And then again, the government saying, well, this is what will be best for everyone by, rounding up all the Japanese people in America and placing them in these, as they called them, relocation camps.
But let's call them what they were, concentration camps.
Yeah. So anyway, we're going to end it there. We'll bring you more lighthearted stuff in the next few weeks. We're actually getting into animation.
That's clever. I like that.
Thank you. I can't take full credit for it. Blake helped me come up with it. But we're getting into animation, and even though this is an anime movie and it, in April, it kind of is kicking things off for us. But we'll get a little bit more lighthearted. We're going to do the first animated movies from both Marvel and DC. So that is Ultimate Avengers for Marvel, and then Superman Doomsday for DC. And so check those out. Then there's a couple of one-shots coming that will, like for instance, next week, we'll talk about some old Marvel cartoons with the Marvel superheroes from the 60s. So check that out. And again, didn't want to really put everybody down for this episode, but...
Can I do a Disney Princesses episode next?
Yeah, so didn't want to put everybody down for this episode, but I really, really felt that we needed to talk about this episode, this movie, and this graphic novel.
It's an important story that should not go quiet.
Yeah. So again, we highly recommend you watch it. Just be prepared. And it'll open to some good conversations, probably with your partner, your spouse, your friends, whoever else you may watch this movie with.
I would be interested to talk about that during someone who was maybe an adult during, the 80s. Like your parents, being able to speak to your parents or my parents and, talking to them about, was that something you actively were concerned about? Did it occur, if you were to be in that scenario, what steps would you have taken?
Especially if they were children in the 50s and the 60s. But again, we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for here. So again, thank you, Bethany, for trudging through this. I know it was very emotional for you, but I knew you would be a good person to share this experience with. Because honestly, if I were to have done this episode with, let's say Chad, it would probably be a little bit more awkward. I'm just going to be honest.
Yeah.
So again, go out and see it. We highly recommend it.
It's super easy to access if you're friends with us. Laramie has it on Blu-ray.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for listening. Rate and review the show, and I'll just end it here. For today, for Moving Panels, I'm Laramy Wells, and I'll see you on the other side of the page.